Hello, welcome back to the channel. I'm Zach Markowski with Sharper Pen Image Consulting, and today we are going on a journey, and I hope you're ready for it. But I wanted to start with what I talked about in the last video, and that was the meaning crisis, or what's been called a meaning crisis. And it's not that this is new or manufactured, although it is, but we'll get to that. What it is that life isn't just suffering, it's meaningless suffering. And if people cannot contain themselves and their mind, their body within the context of modern life and all that it entails, then that already begins to set many problems in motion. And then the problem with calling it a meaning crisis is a crisis is manufactured. And what a crisis is a manufactured platform upon which infinite mobilizations can take place, just in a circle of management, basically. Management, control, those kinds of things. And while I'm going to get into some quotes from Emerson and also Thus Spake Zarathustra, the Soothsayer, I actually came across this talk from Terence McKenna, and I think he called the position correctly in talking about kind of the modern position being that the kind of neotenous cultural blanket that the West has provided of this shallow culture that's meant to kind of keep people busy in what is, as he called it, history being eschatology shockwave. Kind of, you can think this thing was set in motion a long time ago, which was a force that wasn't just pushing us but pulling us. And this notion has long been present that, the present determines the future and the future sneaks up on us from behind. But it's not just a new crisis. It's that these things were foretold, and all the traits and habits that led there, including an increase in novelty and the production of art, has been kind of foretold already. That in the wake of history's ending, you get a massive wave of creativity that goes along with the squander, right? And I understand that people are upset at all this, and part of attacking um, things seen as whether it's decadence or a fall from grace or a fall from religion or the death of God or the death of politics or whatever these things, however people can conceive them, regardless, their platforms are infinite mobilizations, right? Endless groups warring against each other. As Hobbes called civilization, the war of all against all. In war, civil war, it's not the same as nature. But let's start with um, where we're at, or where we were at about 20, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, I think, as McKenna mentioned something here.
Else, the cultural, linguistic, and habitual assumptions that are masking that presence of Tao. It really is true, as the Bible says, you must become as a little child. That means you must become pre-culture. You must recover who you were before the engines of culture went to work on you and abused you and made you afraid and dumbed you down and distorted your values and so on. Yeah.
That was mainly the point there. Um, as he says, if you heard that, he's out of everything in the Bible that was relevant and what little remains that is, um, that's the key, is that you must become as a child, because the culture is already there, but it can't provide anything for a growing mind, because the illusion behind the meaning crisis, or whatever these, everything that has led to the shared sense of loss, confusion, identity, the all the madness and insanity we see, all these forces at work that conduce towards this attitude of doom, or doomerism, as the kids call it these days. Um, it exists for a reason. It's the prevalence of pessimism and nihilism. And it's not a fluke, and it's not an accident. It's the culture created it. It was the seed in Christianity, and by proxy, it's politics and even freedom. The moment you try to enforce freedom with laws, right, it ceases being freedom. So back to liberalism being the turning of mankind into cattle, which takes us to our next point, which is what Emerson is talking about in his essay Nature, which I'll include links to, but or actually I don't know if you're allowed to. Well, I think Gutenberg, you can, because it's public access. I shall therefore conclude this essay with some tradition of man and nature, which a certain poet sang to me, and which, as they have always been in the world, and perhaps reappear to every bard, may be both history and prophecy. The foundations of man are not in matter but in spirit, but the element of spirit is eternity. To it, therefore, the longest series of events, the oldest chronologies are young and recent. In the cycle of the universal man, from whom the known individuals proceed, centuries are points, and all history is but the epoch of one degradation. Pretty good. We distrust and deny inwardly our sympathy with nature. We own and disown our relation to it by turns. We are, like Nebuchadnezzar, dethroned, bereft of reason, and eating grass like an ox. But who can set limits to the remedial force of spirit? I like how he uses remedial there, like a relearning force of the spirit, a correcting force of the spirit, because the spirit's a stomach. And what happens if you have a bunch of them trying to devour the world and each other? A man is a god. Oh, and this is pretty solemn. A man is a god in runes. When men are innocent, life shall be longer and shall pass into the immortal. It sounds like the Tao, doesn't it? As gently as we awake from dreams, now the world would be insane and rabid if we awake, right, unpleasantly awake from dreams. And I had written a note, though I didn't read it, which is to say, when people say we have to mobilize against these crises, and especially this meaning crisis, what they're saying is, how can we put these people back to sleep? Because the bigger issue is that the repressions that used to work and be shared are no longer shared and no longer work. So everyone, all the king's forces and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty back together again. That's therefore, the remedial force of the spirit. A man is a god in runes. Okay. Now the world would be insane and rabid if these disorganizations should last for hundreds of years. Remember, in this meaninglessness crisis, the meaninglessness of suffering crisis, we're about 125 years in. It is kept in check by death and infancy. Infancy is a perpetual Messiah, which comes into the arms of fallen men and pleads with them to return to paradise. Man is a dwarf of himself. Once he was permeated and dissolved by spirit, he filled nature with his overflowing currents. Out from him sprang the sun and the moon, from man the sun, from women the moon. The laws of his mind, the periods of his actions externized themselves into day and night, into the year and the seasons. But, having made for himself this huge shell, his waters retired. He no longer fills the veins and veinlets. He is shrunk to a drop. He sees, and the structure still fits him, but fits him colossally. Say, rather, once it fitted him, now it corresponds to him from of the sun, and women the follower of the moon. This is why he says he who must be a man must be a nonconformist. Yet sometimes he starts in his slumber and wonders at himself and his house. And I actually wonder if this is a reference to the loss of our second sleep cycle, because going back to archaic days, to even I think just pre-industrial revolution, it's kind of understood that we used to sleep differently. So with our work hours changing and our workday changing to fit one world schedule, there went, that. So I'm wondering, I think that's what he's referencing. And I don't know if, actually, no, he existed at that point in time, so he must have been observing that sleep cycle was being disturbed by man's own disturbance of and at himself. Say rather, once it fitted him, now it corresponds to him from far and on high. He adores timidly his own work. Is it biphasic sleep cycles? Is that what it's called? Maybe I'll look it up and find a link. Now is man the follower of the sun, and the woman the follower of the moon. Yet sometimes he starts in his slumber and wonders at himself in his house, and muses strangely at the resemblance betwixt him and it. Like he has no place in it, right? He perceives that if his law is still paramount, if still he have elemental power, if his word is sterling yet in nature, it is not conscious power, it is not inferior but superior to his will. It is instinct. Thus my Orphic poet sang. And this is interesting because I think this gets into those dichotomies, right? On one hand, reason, on one hand, instinct, on one hand, natural, on one hand, unnatural. And by natural, I mean having that corresponding place to where waking up countless circles and layers removed from any natural position, including the natural sleep cycle, I guess. So, where are we at? At present, man applies to nature but half his force. He works on the world with his understanding alone. He lives in it and masters it by penny wisdom. And he that works most in it is but half a man. And whilst his arms are strong and his digestion good, his mind is embruted, and he is a selfish savage. His relation to nature, his power over it, is through the understanding as by manure. The economic use of fire, wind, water, and the mariner's needle, steam, coal, chemical, agriculture, repairs of the human body by the dentist and the surgeon. This is such resumption of power as if banished kings should buy his territories inch by inch, oof, instead of valuating at once into his throne. And you can almost see like the genealogy of morality in this, right? You can see a lot of familiar symbols that have been further dissected. Emerson lays out the whole philosophical oversoul, overworld imprint here that's available. I could trace, there's countless books in this paragraph. You could say psychological works, metaphysical works, philosophical works, artistic works, scientific works. It's really quite incredible. And honestly, in terms of Emerson's got to be Americans' greatest philosophic and poetic contribution to the species, to all species and subspecies. Anything that has some spirit and yearning and life and vitality in it as well. And I didn't mean to keep reading here, but that's kind of the picture. So if Emerson's seeing this just at that kind of industrial boom where life is beginning to snowball into this completely different direction, you know, back to the meaninglessness crisis amongst it, it's not just so as these old repressions are ripped away, as these old ways of life and conceptions of the world that seemed to work as long as they did are ripped away, you know, we're left with something here. And like I said, it wasn't that this wasn't seen and understood. So if we get into the prevalence of pessimism and nihilism, uh, and no answer and no way out, in some sense, like kind of like the end of the road conclusions the existentialists came to. And I'm not saying they're right because within the confines of their, or right or wrong, because in the confines of their environment and their world, you could consider them instruments themselves, right? And then all back to science, all our tools are but extensions of that initial instrument. So within nature and poetry, especially what Nietzsche talks about in Thus Spake Zarathustra here, he talks about man robbing the animals of their virtues. And you can see that in our poetry and our writing, but also in that everything we do ultimately is in some sort of generalized, I guess this is where Platonism really nailed things in a very concept, way of understanding, is a way of understanding and framing it. It was more accurate than anyone could have envisioned in terms of on the smallest and largest scales of nature. So many of these laws seem to be immutable. Yet where were these laws at the moment of creation? So again, flux seems to go hand in hand, or there's no, that is the mutual arising of the matter, that there's a whole lot of bodies in motion, and the idea that the part of those bodies limited in this limited and moved by these movements would thereby be able to understand it and correct it in a way that would control for outcomes or probabilities and averages begins to sound and look insane. And this is kind of McKenna's platform of what he talked about, because he was mobilizing kind of against, not against culture in the sense that you're fighting decadent and historical forces, although sometimes he headed in that direction like everyone else does, because you can't stop those. It's trying to stop, it's like trying to stop death itself. It's trying to stop reality. It's trying to put the world in stasis. It's trying to construct illusions where they've fallen away quicker than anyone could build or maintain them. Like Emerson says, what if we should waken from our dreams? Should that rabidness and that insanity go on for centuries? And this is 41, the Soothsayer, from Thus Spake Zarathustra. And I saw a great sadness come over mankind. The best turned weary of their works. A doctrine appeared, a faith ran beside it. All is empty, all is alike, all hath been. And from all hills are re-echoed, all is empty, all is alike, all hath been. To be sure we have harvested, but why have all our fruits become rotten and brown? What was it that fell last night from the evil moon? In vain was all our labor, poison hath our wine become. The evil eye hath singed yellow our fields and our hearts. Arid have we all become, and fire falling upon us. Then do we turn dust like ashes. Yea, the fire itself have we made a weary. All our fountains have dried up, even the sea hath receded. All the ground trieth to gape, but the depth will not swallow. Alas, where is there still a sea in which one could be drowned? So soundeth our plaint across shallow swamps. Verily, even for dying have we become too weary. Now do we keep awake and live on in sepulchres. Live on in dusty church corners, or in tombs, or in monuments that have lost their meaning. Thus did Zarathustra hear a soothsayer speak, and the foreboding touched his heart and transformed him. Sorrowfully did he go about and wearily, and he became like unto those of whom the soothsayer had spoken. Verily said unto his disciples, A little while, and there cometh the long twilight. Alas, how shall I preserve my light through it? That it may not smother in this sorrowfulness. To remoter worlds shall it be a light, and also to the remotest nights. A light is a metaphor, a comfort, a guide, a truth, a shining beacon, or whatever you might call it. Thus did Zarathustra go about grieved in his heart, and for 3 days he did not take any meat or drink. He had no rest and lost his speech. He's convalescing. At last it came to pass that he fell into a deep sleep. His disciples, however, sat around him in long night watches and waited anxiously to see if he would awake, and speak again and recover from his affliction. And this is the discourse that Zarathustra spoke when he awoke. His voice, however, came unto his disciples as from afar. Hear, I pray you, the dream that I dreamed, my friends, and help me to divine its meaning. A riddle is it still unto me, this dream. The meaning is hidden in it and encaged, and doth not yet fly above on free pinions. He's saying it's not yet flying around freely understood. And I've looked into interpretations, and there's not like so much in this book. So much is absent from people's interpretations. So many references and hidden gems are not understood as self-referential literary points like in the Bible or any other book, where the book references itself and also past historical and other events and people. There's a lot of this in here. It's ripe with it. I know Carl Gustav Jung covers Zarathustra, but a lot of that's like Nietzsche talking about Schopenhauer's Educator, which relates here because that's some of the interpretations are a Schopenhauerian one, which I'll get to at the end here. But I don't think that's thorough enough, and I don't think that's quite right, because yes, you could say it pertains to perhaps a certain notion of suffering and pessimism and nihilism, but it still resolves itself in Christian impulses, in a religious quietus of, better to, in passive nihilism, again, saying better to have never been born and then cut it out, right? Again, going against historical forces. decadence, spiraling out from the decadence, decline, in the will, into, and then in the modern day you could say into the manifestations. And I think this is actually part of what Nietzsche is predicting here. He's saying that it's become, the image itself is becoming mass produced. He's already saying that about men and mankind, that the smallest man and the greatest man, they share so much in common, they're hardly not alike, right? Or they're hardly, yeah, not that they're hardly alike, but they're hardly not alike, that all too similar to each other are they. Where is a better man? Where is the evolution of man? What does that future look like? Why aren't we building and sacrificing towards that rather than, these other mobilizations that go nowhere? They're not investing in people, is what I'm saying. No one's investing in people. That's part of how we got here. The image works, I guess, is another way of saying it. The image and the projector. So we were at, Zarathustra was going about grieved. He got into his convalescence. He woke from his dream. He says, "Here I pray you, the dream that I dreamed, my friends, and help me to divine its meaning." So let's see if we can understand. "All life had I renounced, so I dreamed," right? He gave up unwilling. "Night watchman and grave guardian had I become, aloft in the lone mountain fortress of death. There did I guard his coffins, full stood in musty vaults of those trophies of victory. Out of glass coffins did vanquished life gaze upon me." So he's in this death fortress, nobody's there, just him alone. I could see that as the notion of history, man, greatness, the images of our greatest thinkers, fighters, scientists, everything that we think made history and man great, possibly, right? Because if we go back to the beginning, we're talking about man and his works, right? What's the Soothsayer talking about? Not some future that we fell into, some force of man, some force of man even. So all life had I renounced, so I dreamed. He's alone in the lone mountain fortress of death. There did I guard his coffins. Full stood the musty vaults of those trophies of victories. Yes, out of glass coffins, vanquished life gaze upon me. The odor of dust-covered eternities did I breathe. Sultry and dust-covered lay my soul, and who could have aired his soul there? A way of saying that is like, how could you identify? And also maybe how could you relieve how could you find comfort and friendship therein if he had become such a musty, dusty, sad, sorrowful sack, Brightness of midnight was ever around me. Lonesomeness cowered beside her, and as the third death rattle stillness, the worst of my female friends. Keys did I carry, the rustiest of all keys, and I knew how to open with them the most creaking of all gates. Like a bitterly angry croaking ran the sound through the long corridors when the leaves of the gate opened. Ungraciously did this bird cry. Unwillingly was it awakened. But more frightful even, and more heart-strangling was it, when it again became silent and still all around, and I alone sat in the malignant silence. Thus did time pass with me and slip by, if time still there was. What do I know thereof? So he's just saying he's out of space and time. Zarathustra became unstuck in time, and it's not the first or last time that'll happen. But at last there happened that which would awoke me, right? And these are metaphors and layers. Same thing above when he says, unwillingly was it awakened. And I want to say elsewhere he says, unwillingly was I awakened, but I might be mistaken. Or it just happened so. Thrice did their peals at the gate like thunders. Thrice did the vaults resound and howl again. Then did I go to the state. Alpa, cried I, who carried his ashes to the mountain. Alpa, Alpa, who carriest the ashes unto the mountain. And I pressed the key and pulled at the gate, and exerted myself, but not a finger's breadth was it yet opened. Then did a roaring wind tear the folds apart, whistling, whizzing, and piercing. It threw unto me a black coffin, and in the roaring and whistling and whizzing, the coffin burst open, and spouted out 1,000 peals of laughter, And 1,000 caricatures of children, angels, owls, fools, and child-sized butterflies laughed and mocked and roared at me. Fearfully was I terrified thereby. It prostrated me, and I cried with horror as I never cried before. But mine own crying awoke me, and I came to myself. Thus did Zarathustra relate his dream, and then was silent, for as yet he knew not the interpretation thereof. But the disciple whom he loved most arose quickly, and Zarathustra's hand had said, seized Zarathustra's hand, and said, Thy life itself interpreteth unto this dream, O Zarathustra. Art thou not thyself the wind with shrill whistling, which bursteth open the gates of the fortress of death? He's not right. Art thou not thyself the coffin full of many-hued malices and angel caricatures of life? Nope. Verily, like 1,000 peals of children's laughter cometh Zarathustra into all sepulchres, laughing at those night watchmen and grave guardians, and whoever else rattleth with sinister keys. Which is kind of true, but the disciple's missing the lesson here. With thy laughter wilt thou frighten and prostrate them, fainting and recovering wilt thou demonstrate thy power over them. It's not the point. And when the long twilight cometh and the mortal weariness, even then wilt thou not disappear from our firmament, thou advocate of life. Well, he's not wrong there. And when the long twilight cometh and new stars hast thou made us see, and new nocturnal glories. Verily, laughter itself hast thou spread out over us like a many-hued canopy. Now will children's laughter ever come from coffins flow. Now will a strong wind ever come victoriously unto all mortal weariness. Of this thou art thyself the pledge and the prophet. Verily, they themselves did thou dream, thine enemies, that was thou sorest dream. But as thou awokest from them and camest to thyself, so shall they awaken from themselves and come unto thee. Thus spake the disciple, and all the others then thronged around Zarathustra, grasped him by the hands, and tried to persuade him and leave his bed of sadness, and return unto them. Zarathustra, however, sat upright on his couch, with an absent look, like one returning from a foreign sojourn, did he look on his disciples and examine their features. But still he knew them not. When, however, they raised him and set him upon his feet, behold, all on a sudden his eye changed. He understood everything that had happened, stroked his beard, and said with a strong voice, Well, this hath just had its time, but see to it, my disciples, that we have a good repast and without delay. Thus do I speak to make amends for bad dreams. Right? He's recognizing that he was afflicted too, and now he's come back to himself, and what he carries is his own, and it's incidental that he brought back these bad dreams, and that he again awoke to himself. And he talks about that later, about harming, speaking in a way that hurts his friends, and that he knows there's a certain amends owed. And he even says, but I knew how to lure you back with shepherd's flutes. But maybe that even predates this, not predates, but precedes this in the text, because that's fit into the whole thing, really. So the disciple gets it wrong, and I've seen a common interpretation, and it's also in one of the translations, that this is about Schopenhauer, will and representation, that in the absence of will, you just have representation, perhaps, right? So this is like that, the stasis of the Apollonian vision, and Zarathustra's up there because I guess if man is weary of his works and there can be no more greatness except where designated and managed by new idols, i.e. the state, and the former greatness and history of man is just all in the past and all bones to be discovered. There he found himself alone in this painful aftermath, understanding the Soothsayer's vision of the future, and that he saw it too, because you could argue that the Soothsayer is part of himself, part of the seven seals, part of the tones and hues of rainbow sound, and also of both vision and sound, right? And that kind of gets into what this whole Dithyram is about, to awaken emotional states in one. But I think the disciple gets it wrong because he just sees it all. He sees it as a positive. He sees it all as a matter of laughter. Like Zarathustra has solved it all. Zarathustra has fixed it. Zarathustra, no, this is beyond Zarathustra even, right? Because he's the one who's kind of living in this. He's the one living through this dream space of, you could say, time and space condensed down into a poetic and religious mythos. Um, so there's the Schopenhauerian education, or not education, but kind of conception that encapsulates that notion that with the Dionysia, or with the Apollonian being a vision that perhaps can no longer compete with itself or keep itself alive because it no longer even can serve the purpose of solving to repress, or to suppress or channel, you could say, the various human drives and things that are happening inside the human being. Whereas within modern scientific conception, the idea is that everything can be managed and controlled for. And I think you kind of see, and I don't know if Nietzsche was seeing an age of the mass-produced image, like he saw one of those little spinning, you could think of those little optical illusions of the first animations where it was a cylindrical tube with a bunch of different images, and when you spun it and looked through a slot in the side, you could see that it was moving. Let's say if it was an understanding that we would produce these images in mass, and then it would be whether it would just be overwhelming, whether it would just be destructive, because yet there's this part of him talking about carrying his own ashes to the mountains, right? And I think he is talking about the profundity of ego death, or kind of recognizing your place in space and time. And he's recognizing, and maybe in some sense, himself as a fatality. So he got stuck in that fatal space where he was living, because he could see enough of the future to see it was destruction, that he as a genius had a weird place in the world, so he had time to himself to think and write. But, in terms of the world's understanding of him, he was dead to the world. And I think that's been a lot of modern people's position, and you can see it in, up there we have a lot of Emile Turan, and honestly, so like a lot of modern literature on this shelf that speaks to these conditions, which is why those books are there. There's some nonsense there for fun too, but also a lot of things that you could see as the result of these historical forces. And this was just me kind of doing my part to interpret the dream here. But I think the bigger issue is that the larger thing is him having awoken in his place in time, which he speaks to many times in this text, right? Because like any spiritual text, there's a lot about sight, seeing, hearing, listening, awakening, but he's not saying to this one singular God image, but to, I guess, the wisdom of pagan understanding, which was a many-toned, many-hued, many-faceted life that wasn't falsely and arbitrarily channeled and robbed, denied, and left over as man being living ruins of himself. Gone from his natural sleep cycles, gone from his natural hunting cycles, gone from his natural methods and modes of expressing, living, relating, right? And it all conduces towards the loss of will, and in its stead representation, and that's what modern life and the death of modern life all came to. So again, when people attack whether it's modern art, I think some artists and critics better understand that the rules are kind of suspended in this creative flood, because no one can speak to the whole of what is happening at the moment. Later on down the line, there will be judges to and historians to record, or say, and poets as well, and more artists to further augment, because the bigger conception is thus that whatever people are fighting about or at or over today, it won't matter, because 100 to 500 years from now, if the larger species is still alive, I promise you their way of thinking and looking at the world and understanding the world, as well as the way they live their life, won't be exactly the same as it was, is now, or has been. And maybe that's for the worse, maybe that's for the better, who can really say, but that's kind of the point. So everyone who's stuck in the moment, they're ambered in time. They're right where the soothsayer foretold they would be, because they're in the middle of 2 centuries of nihilism and so many active and passive forces playing out. Lines of ascending life, lines of descending life, a creative explosion, a lot of insanity, many things all happening at once, being related at once. And as I mentioned in the noontime video, it's seeing those who increasingly see and understand, with or without context, and without closure, right? They're going to continue to feel and suffer and live this out themselves. And I think a lot of people are perfectly happy and fine where they are. What McKenna said in his video is that a lot of the people doing the management and the control and these sorts of things, they're not evil, they're not this or that. It's just they're creatively and intelligently bankrupt. So maybe that's a good place to end this. All those having awakened to or awakening to this dream, or what I said in a podcast, for instance, a few years ago, I said something like, the cultural fallout will continue for years and years to come, and it's going to keep coming, and that the biggest fallout is the people. Here's what McKenna says.
Yeah, see, I think what's happened is at the top of the culture, it's profoundly intellectually bankrupt.
No goal.
There is no plan except to keep peddling stuff, basically until the forests are gone and the ocean's polluted. And
there's no plan but to keep peddling stuff until everything's gone and depleted, right? Just to manage a controlled burn, basically, he's saying. Creatively and intelligently bankrupt. You could say there's no gold at the top of the pyramid, right? That was stolen a long time ago.
And this is not malevolent. It's not malevolent. It's simply they are clueless. They have run out of steam.
Right, I told you, they don't know, and they don't know what 100 years is going to be either. They think they do, but they don't know.
With daytime TV, with casino gambling, with lotteries, with endless distractions, with pop culture fads, with cults of celebrity, with spectacular trials and gory mass murders and endless circuses, while the people at the top are saying, sooner or later, the shit is going to hit the fan. Sooner or later, the dam will burst. And they say, well,
right. So the idea that somewhere in there, history will happen. And again, everyone's trying to control and manage for that. Everyone's trying to mobilize against or for that. Everything's being attacked. Everything's being destroyed. As quickly as things is being created, they can be squandered, right? It is an age of squander. And I'm not necessarily laughing at that or laughing at the horror of that. My laughter is somewhere in between because it's my own. But, and I'm relating it to various thoughts and ideas in here. But if you heard that from Terence McKenna, the management is a controlled chaos, is misinformation, as other people have called it the siege of yourself, the siege of your soul, psychoanalysis in reverse. And if you try to reverse engineer your way back through that, chances are you're going to go insane or lose your mind, as you see with conspiracy theorists and a lot of other people and political people who just get mad, or who still believe in the mythologies in a world that constantly attacks and denies them their mythology and refuses the dreams they're offering. Because I think there are a lot of, various types losing their minds for various reasons. But that's kind of the plan. So if you kind of can see where we're at, the artist is then there to say, if you can see our present, you can see the future of the future. And we're going to get into the evolution of kind of how we got here, which was the evolution of strength and intelligence. And it came from weakness, actually, right? That it took weakness. It took not knowing to require the need of knowing. And this is all the necessity that life has been. So it's nobody's fault. Everyone's just playing their part. It's playing out as the soothsayer foresaw, and we're going to continue to see day by day, moment to moment, spanning out to our eternity, wherever that goes, as it goes. So wherever this finds you, in the present here, me in the past, you in the future, I hope you're well. Take care of yourselves, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.